By 1910, airplanes had improved to the point where they were considered a reasonable form of travel, and so people began focusing on how to make them safer. One big safety concern with airplanes at the time was there was no parachutes small enough or light enough to be taken on board with passengers, and so if the plane malfunctioned and was crashing, everybody had to go down with it. So in 1911, a prominent French aviation club offered a large sum of money to anybody who could design a parachute for airplane passengers. A man named Franz Reichels, who was a tailor in Paris but who had always had a fascination with aviation, saw this reward in the paper and decided to take on this challenge. The design he came up with was not an external device like a backpack. Instead, it was a full suit with foldable bat wings that attached to the passenger's arms, connected all the way down to their ankles. Using his sewing know-how, he stitched up this totally bizarre-looking prototype, and he attached it to a dummy and threw it off of his apartment building. And amazingly, the dummy landed lightly on the ground. But when Franz, who significantly outweighed this dummy, put on his parachute suit and latched off of the building himself, he did not touch the ground lightly. He smashed into the ground and broke his leg. But Franz was undeterred. He made dozens of changes. Soon he added material, he subtracted material, and after a while he felt like it was ready to be submitted to this French aviation club. But when the club members watched one of Franz's dummies wearing the suit come crashing into the ground because the canopy collapsed, they rejected his design. Franz was offended and decided he would prove them wrong. So in 1911, Franz began petitioning the city of Paris to allow him to test his design off of the Eiffel Tower. If he jumped from one of their platforms, that would be high enough for his canopy to fully inflate, thereby showing that his design really did work. In 1912, and the city said, okay, you know what, Franz, you can test your parachute on the Eiffel Tower. What the city didn't know, because Franz had intentionally kept a secret from them, was he didn't intend to launch a dummy off of the Eiffel Tower wearing his suit. He was going to put the parachute suit on and jump off these 17 stories himself. And so on February 4th of that year, Franz arrived at the tower, and standing around the base of it was a throng of people and journalists who had all read about this experiment in the newspaper. Then Franz Fabli turned around and began walking up the stairs towards the platform, and with him was a journalist who brought a camera. Once Franz reached the platform, the journalist began filming him, and this video would capture Franz climbing upon the railing and then hesitating, and he anxiously begins kind of rocking back and forth like he's debating whether he's really didn't do this, and then at some point he rolls up the courage and he jumps, and immediately his suit collapses and he slams into the ground, dying instantly. Another cameraman was on the ground and he filmed Franz's final jump. Here is a still shot of Franz right before impact.